Hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor who tries to help you have context to understand what's happening in the war against Ukraine. I'm using that language intentionally because it was changed to the war in Ukraine in the G20 statement. Today I'm going to talk about the G20 and I'm going to kind of geek out about it. I'm going to talk about the background of the G20. I'm going to talk about what happened at the G20, what the major events were, how it affected Ukraine, what the reactions were from major politicians that were there. It's going to be comprehensive about the G20. It's probably going to be one of my least watched videos ever because it's such a esoteric topic. But when you get done with this, you will understand a lot about how the G20 works and specifically how this G20 conference or summit affected Ukraine. Okay, so I'm going to start here, and we're going to start at the beginning with what is the G20 and why is it important. This is a Indian news, I believe, English News 24 channel explaining the background of the G20, the economic roots of the G20, and I'm only going to watch a portion of it, and I'll stop periodically.
Before that, let's understand what the G20 is all about, how it was formed, what it does, and what India's presidency means. Time to hit the rewind button. The year is 1999. The Asian financial crisis is in the rear-view mirror. But the experience is not forgotten. Countries realize that globalization isn't perfect, that they need more cooperation. Enter the G20. The first meeting was held in Berlin in 1999. It wasn't a heads of state summit though. That came much later. The 1999 meeting was attended by the finance ministers. 20 countries and blocs were in attendance, 20 of the biggest economies at that time. You can see the list here. West Asia has just 2 members, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Latin America has 3, and Africa just 1. There are 19 countries plus 1 bloc, which is the European Union. Arithmetically, it's a powerful group. The G20 makes up 85% of global GDP.
Now that's important, right? I mean, the size of the G20 is why this is an important bloc. And again, it is an economic bloc that has a little political leaning, but it's not like the UN where it's trying to decide any kind of real policies. It's just different. But 85% of global GDP, that's phenomenal.
75% of global trade, 60% of land area, and 2/3 of the world population. At the heart of it, the G20 is an economic grouping. Just look at what their official document says. G20 is the premier forum for international economic cooperation, and it plays an important role in shaping and strengthening global architecture and governance on all major international economic issues. Today, the scope has expanded. The G20 now plays a key role in political issues. One example would be the Ukraine war, but more on that later. The G20 is different from other organizations like the United Nations or even alliances like NATO. For starters, it's informal. There's no permanent headquarters or staff. Instead, the presidency rotates. Every member holds the presidency for 1 year. For that 1 year, they are in charge of everything. Setting the agenda, running the website, deciding the theme, and of course, hosting the summits. Last year was Indonesia's turn. This year is India's. And next year is Brazil's. That's 3.
And the president of Brazil said that next year Putin can come because there will be no danger of him being arrested if he comes to Brazil.
Developing countries in a row. India's presidency began on December 1st, 2022. It ends on November 30th this year. The theme for India's presidency is this: Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means one earth, one family, one future. The theme highlights...
So the theme was unity, right? And they worked toward unity. Now, what did that mean for Ukraine? We'll see in just a moment.
Sustainable and responsible choices. Not just for individuals, but also for governments. India's vision is for a just and equitable world. It calls for navigating crises in a sustainable, holistic, responsible, and inclusive manner.
Okay, so let's look at what this meant practically. By the way, before we do this, one of the things that the dignitaries did, this was President Biden's post, was an honor to visit the Rajghat Memorial today. This is to honor Gandhi. So you see the memorial and you'll see the dignitaries walking out to it and visiting. Okay, so there's a number of these guys. All right. Okay. What were the takeaways? Well, there was softer language on the war in Ukraine. That's unfortunate. And we'll talk about that to some great degree here in just a moment. The African Union was inside the club. They were added to it. U.S., Saudi, and India joined hands for a transport corridor under the sea. There's an under the sea grid connection as well. Incremental progress on climate change. Modi boosts the standing of India because being in India, it actually was, highlighting things and bringing their stature up in the view of the world. Okay, what wasn't talked about were things like South Korea president announced a $2.3 billion in humanitarian aid. Now that's 300 million in provided initially, and 2 billion in the form of long-term low interest loans starting in 2025. Nonetheless, there's two things about that. One, it's a loan. Two, it is support, but it is humanitarian support. South Korea, if you understand South Korea, doesn't really give military support to those in the conflict. It's just part of their cultural how they operate. But this is a big step the right kind of direction, and it's not nothing, right? It was overlooked, but it was important. One of the big things, as far as most of the world will be concerned, is that the African Union was invited to take their place as a full member of the G20. So we went from 85% of the world's GDP. We just increased that some. I don't know by how much is the African Union, what that's going to be most of the African continent. I don't know how much that's going to affect the rate of or the amount of GDP, but it can't hurt, right? Okay. Now, here is a little bit more of this is the Voice of America giving its recap, and you'll see a little bit more. G20 calls for Ukraine peace. Stop short of naming Russia. Okay, but we know that Russia's the one that's doing the thing. Well, let's
It was
just
what
hear.
G20 leaders sought at this year's summit, and it's what they say they got, with language that called for a comprehensive, just, and durable peace in Ukraine, but that stopped short of naming Russia as the aggressor. The group also agreed that the use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible.
By removing the words Russia and the word aggression, they gave Mr. Putin a face-saving gesture, and we'll now wait and see if he then reciprocates by doing what all G20 members except him agree to, and that's getting out of all of Ukraine.
At the start of the
And that's not going to happen. So it's nice that there's a face-saving gesture, but he's not going to do anything because of the face-saving gesture. So all that did was make it look like they watered down support. I could be wrong, but just follow the story and see what happens over
New
time.
Delhi summit, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi urged consensus.
आज G20 के प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर
Today, as the president of G20, India calls upon the entire world to first convert this global trust deficit into faith. It is time for all of us to move together.
The wide-ranging agreement, which spanned issues like trade, economic growth and development, climate change, reform of multilateral institutions, technology, taxation, gender equality, and more, was reached on the first day of the meeting, despite the absence of Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Both were represented by senior officials. Washington's argument for supporting Ukraine hinged on the significant economic consequences of the conflict, the White House told VOA.
The war in Ukraine has put a huge strain on lower middle-income countries when it comes to food security, energy security, inflationary pressure. You can't discount the effect that Mr. Putin's war has had on the global economy. And what the president wants to pursue, and he'll mention the war in Ukraine specifically as he pursues this, are opportunities for these lower middle-income countries to be able to pursue investment opportunities and loans for infrastructure development that are high quality, that are transparent,
And this is a fair argument for him to be making in this kind of context at the G20 because it's an economic forum primarily. Okay, what are some of the reactions? Well, here's the Japanese Prime Minister
Question
reacting.
is, do you think the G20 is more divided than ever before on geopolitical issues such as Ukraine? And will the world community continue to look at the G20 to do more on these issues? Because the UN is being seen as largely dysfunctional. Thank you. はい、まず現在、国際社会は
Thank you. First of all, today, as the world faces compound crisis, collaboration at the G20 as the premier forum for international economic cooperation is becoming increasingly important. Russia's aggression of Ukraine is shaking the very foundation of cooperation at the G20.
Mm-hmm.
It could shake the basis of cooperation at the G20. Further, it is causing an enormous impact to the world economy through such factors as the protracted rise of food and energy prices.
Okay, so right there, Russia's aggression of Ukraine is causing the protracted rise of food and energy prices. Okay, it's a cause of this, and so he's hitting the nail on the head a little stronger. So that's the Japanese Prime Minister. Here is Mark Rutte of the Netherlands talking about the statement that was put out, and we'll talk about that in just a moment.
Are you happy with the New Delhi declaration, especially the paragraphs on Ukraine, or do you think it was a compromise?
It was a compromise, clearly, and that's always the case when you come together with multilateral teams like the G20, so the Ukraine. But I was happy with the fact that there were some key elements in the declaration which were very important. But obviously, if I would have written it myself, it would have been different. But I was not on my own. We were there with a whole bunch of people, and I think it was good that India was able to broker a declaration by the 20, by all the members.
Okay, so he was saying
It's a crisis.
Hello?
Are you happy with the New Delhi declaration, especially the paragraphs on Ukraine, or do you think it was a compromise?
It was a compromise, clearly, and that's always the case when you come together with multilateral teams like the G20, so the Ukraine. But I was happy with the fact that there were some crisis.
So he was saying that it was a compromise clearly, and he would have preferred to see it something different. Okay, so it was an economic, they were focused on economic issues, but the statement said things like, we condemn all aggression. It's almost like you'd have the, let me give you the analogy. So the statement said that we condemn all aggression, not Russian aggression. It's almost like we're making no distinction between the burglar that breaks into your house and the homeowner that fights him off and say, we just condemn violence. And that's not really a fair way of looking at it. Here's the statement, and this is Oleg Nikolenko. Now, he's a spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ukraine, and he said this: the G20 adopted a final declaration. We're grateful to the partners who tried to include strong wording in the text. However, in terms of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, G20 has nothing to be proud of. This is how the main elements of the text could look to be closer to reality. So concerning the war in Ukraine, he says, against Ukraine, all states must act in a manner consistent with purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety. But it's only Russia that's the issue here. Okay, Russia must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. On war in Ukraine, it should be against Ukraine. It should be Russia must refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition against territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of any state. On the war against Russia, it should say, or on the war against Ukraine, it should say, on the war against Ukraine, Russia's use or threat of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, is what it should say. And then on the Ukraine crisis, there were different views and assessments of the situation. That should just be totally struck out. Where Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, members of the G20 unequivocally condemned it and called it on Moscow to immediately end it. Now, why did it come out the way that it came out in this watered down way? Because Russia was there and Russia had to agree to it. It's like saying the thief's invited to have a say on should there be violence or shouldn't there be violence. It's like, that's just unfair. And then this meme kind of drives the point home. This is not what was said, but just putting words into the mouth of the picture. And then we remove the wording such as Russian aggression and condemn from the G20 resolution. Wait, it gets even better. Now it's called the war in Ukraine, not the war against Ukraine. Big win for Putin and loss for sleepy Biden. Okay. There's something to that. I think that the way that we watered down, and I say we, I wasn't there, I didn't have any part of it, but the way that the G20 watered down the language here, look, I think Russia can use this and say, look, you can't do that. Like, concerning the war in Ukraine, all states must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety. Like, you can't take territory. Well, but you can't take the Donbass back. This is now Russian territory, and you can't take it. I think that's the way that they'll argue it. At any rate, okay, so that's an overview of the G20, what happened, how it affects Ukraine. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Put that in the comments below. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes, and the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.